I'm a true civil servant, and if you stay on for long enough, you will be able to go quite a lot of different places if you take the right views. I really am very proud to be here as a Danish ambassador talking about the European Union. I know that European Union to many Americans is a very abstract and difficult concept to comprehend, and I really accept that. I think it's very appropriate that I'm here at the Halley Institute at the Emory University, and I'm really very happy to be here with my honorary consul, with my colleagues, both the Trade Commissioner and my colleague at the embassy. But I'm especially proud to be here with so many of you. I think this is really an opportunity for me, not to hear myself speak once more about the European Union, but especially to have remarks, comments, and questions from you afterwards when I've given this, hopefully not too long and too boring presentation. One of you said very, I think, correctly, that this is actually a very provocative title in the US. European Union, that I just admitted, is a very difficult, comprehensible project. It's not a state, it's not a superpower. And then I pretend that it is a rising superpower. How can that possibly be true? And what can these Europeans tell us Americans? What we here in the United States needs to do is to do real foreign policy, and then hopefully the others in the world society will support us, and the more they support us, the better. The numbers of the European Union, 27 member states, GDP, are what we have calculated to be $14.38 trillion. And if you look at the GDP of China, Japan, and India, that's exactly the same total amount. So therefore, just as a natural, simple consequence of economics, European Union as an entity is a global power. Anybody who would contest that would have to say that China, Japan, and India, not by themselves, are global powers. We, the Europeans, in the European Union, form an entity that economically is as mighty as these three big entities all together. We are a little bit bigger than the US, and therefore, you have to, I think, accept as a part of departure that given today's sort of comprehensive assessment of what makes a superpower or power, economics will always have to be at the core. You cannot really credibly, in a very strong way or in a very influential way, imagine that a country could be a power or a superpower without having the necessary and sufficient economic means at disposal. The European Union as an entity do really, I think, represent that. The definition that I have taken is a definition, a state with a leading position in the international system and an ability to project power on a worldwide scale. We Europeans would maintain that exactly that definition is what we, given our history and our economic might, our altogether political interests in the world society, live up to that definition. Academically, it's, I think, a very often discussed definition, but many, I think, scholars would agree this is a pretty fair description and definition of a superpower. What is it then that makes us very special superpower? Because we are not a superpower like the United States of America, simply because we do not have the US defense budget. The US defense budget of, I guess, $600 billion is as big as the rest of the whole world's defense budgets. We are often talking about the Russian Federation's defense budget increasing. We are worried about it. We are apprehensive about it. I guess it's fair to say that it's approximately $50 billion these years and growing. So of course, there are needs for apprehension and worries. In what direction will it go? But if you look at it in a global perspective, of course, it's a very minute share compared to the US. The same would go for Europe. We have 2 European Union members that possesses nuclear weaponry. That is, of course, France and UK. They are permanent members of the United Nations Security Councils. And I think it's fair also to say that it is exactly the United States, UK, and France, the so-called P3 countries in the UN Security Council, that normally in a very proactive, constructive way, paves the way for progress, the way we Danes or Europeans sees it and defines it in the world community when producing international binding law, producing the kind of UN Security Council resolutions that most progress, again, the way we Europeans define it, is made of. So given that we have those two countries inside the European Union, we do, of course, possess some military might, but we all realize inside the European Union that those nuclear arsenals that those two European countries possesses are, of course, very much under the control of the French president and the British Prime Minister and government. So it's not a common European instrument. It's not a common policy of the European Union to have nuclear weaponry. It's a very national policy of these two countries. But in spite of that, we are still, for example, a key foreign policy player because we have a political role in the way that we define our common foreign and security policy and really try our level best inside the European Union to adhere to that common foreign and security policy on all major issues. We have, I think it's fair to say, the biggest aid altogether. A small country like Denmark, we do give $3 billion every year in development assistance. It's only 0.85% of our GDP. The US is doing quite much better these years. There's been a continuous and consistent growth in the US development assistance. I guess it's about $27 billion now. But if you calculate a little bit and you compare, therefore, us Danes, 5.5 million, with 300 million Americans, you probably should do not 60 times as much, but maybe 50 or 40 times as much, which would mean that you should give 40 or 50 times 3 billion, and that would not add up to 27. That would add up to maybe 150 or 170 or something like that. My point is not to criticize the US. I think you're doing better. I think you will continue to be doing better in development assistance. You also have what is fair to mention, private philanthropy through big foundations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and many others that really do, I think, very important work in Africa and elsewhere. I really accept that. But because we are giving so much development assistance, and because we have this political system that we have in Europe with this common foreign security policy that, for example, puts so much emphasis on environment, energy policies, climate policies, on human rights policies, we do believe that we are a key foreign policy player. At the same time, we're the largest single market in the world. Many Americans do not really understand the width and the depth of what that really means to us. As a Dane, I can only tell you very briefly that it really is important that we've created a European Union within which we have no border control, no customs, no passport control. So the circulation of goods and services and humans is as free as possible can be. And the kind of scales that we small countries, 5.5 million citizens, can obtain by having such an internal market, 500 million, is of course exactly what many Danes would see as one of the main objectives by having a European Union. One within which we can have our companies grow, like you here in the US have had one big internal market. No border control between your neighboring states here in this state. It would be unthinkable. We have just arrived at that the last few years inside Europe. So these few elements hopefully will describe a little bit of what I am trying to tell, that we therefore am a global power, given what also the world would today define as power and exercise when really pursuing a national interest or European interests. This cannot be just serious. When we were looking at the Olympics, we were very much impressed by many of the American athletes and swimmers, and I do accept that this is a very unscientific way of proving that you are a superpower. But it is gratifying. It's very gratifying to be a European and see that we 27 European countries actually still can compete with countries like the United States and China and Russia when it comes to sports. it is very gratifying, and it is a part of our competitive genes to try to beat you whenever we can, at least in sports. So that is a really important variable that we include in trying to compete with you. First on Mars, I don't want to really expand on that, but we have a lot on going in European, in R&D. I accept the fact that the R&D measured in the US is probably double as high as on average for EU countries, according to OECD statistics. And I will hope that we can revert to that. I think that's very telling for the wisdom and the visionary and dynamic character of the United States, that you have that very high willingness and risk sort of attitude, risk-taking attitude. We Europeans could learn a lot from that. I'm not talking here as a Danish ambassador, because it's always Denmark that is the most happy peoples of the world. But we Europeans seem to have, if you look at the whole list, actually the greatest happiness. It's a funny entity, and you can have many different think tanks and institutes measured in many, many different ways. What I'm trying to say is that apparently the kind of social model, political system that we Europeans try to produce and improve gradually somehow captures the way in which, I think it's fair to say, Western capitalistic democratic systems, think tanks, universities, governments measure happiness. What is that today? It's a very difficult question to answer. These many think tanks could do it many different ways, and if you change some of the weights, of course, you would have a different outcome, and it would suddenly, all of a sudden, to our Danish surprise, be the Swedes who would be the most happy people in the world. And you can do that. You can tinker with that kind of statistics. But what I'm trying, if I should make a serious point, is that lifestyle, quality of life, happiness today is a very, very comprehensive concept. Namely, one that includes, of course, that you are able to house and feed yourself, educate yourself, but also you can live in a clean and safe environment. Clean air is very important, I think, for those many Chinese citizens who start being able to afford in Shanghai a different environment. No crime in an area or a country. Peaceful region like the one we've been able to create with the European cooperation the last 50 years is extremely important in a continent that has been really terrorized by ourselves and all the many, many, many wars that we Europeans have afflicted on each other for centuries and centuries. So altogether, that probably adds up to what would be a modern concept of happiness. But let me quickly Morten, you're probably better to this than I am. This is a slow motion. Oh, I'm pointing at the wrong. Good. If I should, in the next few minutes, present what Europe has come from and what we are right now and will be in the future, I will try to briefly go through this. You can see the first picture, I think, is very descriptive of European history. You could do it in many ways, and as government paid representative, you could do it in a rosy way. I think it's adequate to tell that we Europeans really have produced really a history of conflicts, of instability, of everything but peace. And only the last 50, 60 years have we been able to live for such a long period of time without any real conflicts, but still with a lot of problems. Countries like Belarus, in the heart of Europe, 1 hour's flight from Copenhagen, a complete non-democratic country. The Balkans, you all know what happened in the Balkans when you Americans, we Europeans, had to use modern warfare to kill other Europeans and prevent them from making ethnic cleansing happening. So we Europeans are not really in a position to be very sort of proud and normative in telling other countries and continents how life should be run and how foreign policy should be made, because in our continent we really have this problem that we're now trying to solve. We'll take them much quicker. We'll take them whole pages. This I will not dwell on in a group like this, but just make that one point that what we learned after having joined the alliance in Denmark, for example, was that after having been a neutral country for so many years, we realized that that was not going to be working for us anymore. We had to join a military alliance with which the United States could help us Europeans preserve, hopefully, peace and stability. We also saw European countries produce the European coal and steel community when I was born in '52. And that was the very beginning of European cooperation. This is a brief presentation of what then has happened in terms of success for this European idea of cooperation by integrating countries, by tying Germany, West Germany at the time, into strong binding cooperation where the Council of Ministers, when they took decisions, would have made binding commitments for companies and citizens from that very moment. We've grown from those 6 countries, the West Germany, France, and Italy, and the 3 Benelux countries, very different countries, Luxembourg with 400 citizens, Netherlands with 15 million citizens, Belgium with 10 million countries. We've grown. It took a long time before Charles de Gaulle accepted the Brits inside this construction. And we didn't want Denmark and Ireland to join the European Union cooperation before the Brits could go with us. For different reasons, and I will not dwell on that, but that was the first real important enlargement of the European Union in '72. Then came, and many Americans have forgotten that, in '81 and '86, 2 countries that most Americans, young Americans, would think has always been European democracies. But Spain, Greece, and Portugal were actually military dictatorship when I was a young student. And when I traveled throughout Europe, it was not very pleasant to travel in Spain because it was really a military dictatorship where the policemen or customs could sort of borrow your camera and you would never see it again if it was a nice camera. It was everything but the European leaders in the 9 countries decided that when they had these reforms and revolutions that made those countries start being democracies, the best possible way for us in the real democratic European continent was to take them on and make them members of the European Union and really grow their democracies from within and really try to make them much more advanced countries. That has, I think, been a success beyond imagination. Many people don't remember that very brief and recent history, but this is really some of the biggest accomplishments of the European Union, that we were able to grow that. And from that came also the next waves. The wave in '95 was, I think, a sort of catch up by Austria, Finland, and Sweden, those countries that are finally sort of realized. Now I'm a little bit impertinent by saying that they realized that they should have been part of this construction a long time ago. But before then came the real unification after the end of the Cold War with the 10 Eastern European countries that, again, like Spain, Greece, and Portugal, came out of everything but democracy, and then all of a sudden became willing to take upon themselves this huge burden of some 80,000 pages of legislation defined by the first 6 and then the 9 countries. So it was not what we would call accession negotiations. It is really a one-sided national sort of takeover of what the other countries had already defined, what namely membership of the European Union meant. All the features of a modern society, a modern West European democracy in terms of market economy, from veterinary standards, commercial, financials, everything in a modern society that defines that society in terms of legislation. That was really impressive for us who really wanted to spearhead that process, that given that objective that they could become members, they were willing and capable of really converting their societies into these full-fledged European democracies. I'm not saying that this is still a completely consumed process and that everything is working well, but it's better for us to have these countries inside the European Union and therein gradually grow and improve them as disciplined European Union members. Let's quickly go through these maps. just to prove the point that Europe has really changed borders so many times as you Americans would not believe it. These are the enlargements in waves. There are some countries I would just briefly mention, especially because I'm a Dane. Europe is not completely unified. One of the big sorrows of us Danes is that Norway, as you can see, and Iceland are not members of the European Union. Norway actually did negotiate accession with us Danes in '72 and had a referendum a little bit before ours, which they unfortunately lost. They tried again after the end of the Cold War when Sweden, Austria, Finland, together with Norway, tried to join the European Union. I had a second referendum in which a majority of the Norwegians said no thank you to European Union cooperation. And I would use this Iceland the same. Iceland would probably only be willing to join the European Union together with Norway because of fisheries interest and so on. But this should hopefully show you that pooling sovereignty between member states that are so old that most of us are 800-900 years old, 1,000 years old kingdoms that are now democracies, many of them, is difficult and painful, because when you pool sovereignty, when you share sovereignty, making a common European currency, common justice and home affairs policies, you give up national sovereignty and dominance, but you gain so much more. We think the trade, the economies of scale, the qualified influence on the global political development in terms of a common foreign policy that comprises many issues that many of these member states would not have had in their foreign policies were they not part of the European Union. But to run this argument still is very complicated. The best example of proving this is that we right now in the European Union are trying to ratify a moderated and reduced European constitution that we defined, I think, from a summit in Brussels or in Laken, just outside Brussels in 2001, up till 2005, a fully fledged European constitution, probably what we Europeans at least would call a state-of-the-art constitution in the world society for a democratic cooperation that is not exactly a state, but almost a state and wanting to act like a state on the global scene. And the Dutch and the French rejected it in the summer '05. Then this year, the reduced version, the Lisbon Treaty, was rejected by one country only, the Irish. And I think it's a good sort of proof of how democratic we try to be. Every member state of the 27 had to ratify, of course, this new treaty. Otherwise, it cannot enter into force. And even though it's a small country, 3.5 million, and only a small majority of those people who voted in Ireland, we have to await and find out what to do with the Irish in the future before Europe again can make this new treaty and continue our integration in depth and sort of supplement the many successes that I just described when we've done this integration in the width with all these member states. We Danes as well have had great difficulties in persuading our peoples to believe in European integration as a process within which we could find better national interest taken care of. We've had two referenda, one in '92 where the European Union really made a quantum leap forward by defining a Maastricht Treaty that said that all of a sudden from some common policies in agriculture, trade, and other things, we would want to have a common European defense, common currency. And because a majority of the Danes said no to this, we are still, as of today, not members, fully members of the European defense and the euro. Let me spend just 2 seconds explaining why defense probably did not play well with the Danes in '92. We were just coming out of the Cold War. We Danes were so, I think, good allies that we thought national security, peace in Europe was produced by exactly the alliance workings. And it was the US that in the end won the Cold War. So how could we Danes believe in a European defense with the Germans and others being the primary players, the ones that we've been at wars with for centuries? And unfortunately, a small majority of the Danes therefore rejected the treaty. Same with the euro. Danes did simply not believe in that we could create a European currency that would be so sufficiently strong that we could rely on that to that extent, and the cooperation should be so deep. Now, 16 years later, 2008, we would have had this autumn in Denmark a referendum had the Irish not voted no, because our government could have said, now 16 years later, Europe and European cooperation has proceeded so well that European defense is a reality that we Danes also want to shoulder and be part of when we are in the midst of really producing the meat, the muscles for that European defense identity. And I say this given that we are probably, together with the Brits and few other European, to my mind, too few European countries, a very pro-American country that has seen throughout the last many, many years and decades, United States as the one strategic partner for us in the world community to produce the best kind of national security for us Danes. And that's also why we've been so close with the Bush 41 administration when he went into the first Gulf War, had for the first time for a very, very, very long time in Danish history, all of a sudden military assets applied in the effort to try to liberate Kuwait. We had a very close cooperation with the Clinton administration in order to enlarge NATO. We've had a very, very close cooperation when we want to have the Baltic states recognized as independent states with the US, and also now with the Bush 43 administration, been in Iraq, have 800 Danish soldiers in Afghanistan, making missile defense in Greenland. Many of these things we would think are policies that we want to be part of. I'm not saying that it's always easy or very politically successful to be doing this, but again, you have to be sort of consistent, continuously, strategically observing as a small country, given our history. But therefore, we would probably now find that European defense dimension is a thing that should be pursued. We will just go quicker. The special character of the European Union, I would like to say a little bit about, because that's very difficult to explain to other citizens than just ourselves. Many Europeans don't, I think, actually understand what is the character of European Union. The supranational institutions where you have pooled sovereignty, where EU law is playing a more important role in our national courts' interpretation of disputes, is really controversial. We are, I think, constantly trying to describe to our citizens that some of our EU policies are just intergovernmental in their character. Others are really supranational, and we have these supranational entities and institutions that do make the European work. I am often asked, are we then a state? Of course we're not a state. We're not a state that represents these 27 member states. One good example is here in the United States. All European Union member states really do their level best to act on the bilateral relationship with the United States. The United States is so important that it's really a competition oftentimes between European Union member states. And you as a country oftentimes have administrations that are playing very well on that, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. Other big countries like Russia are doing exactly the same. The Chinese are probably some of the ones who doesn't do it so much, but they of course also do it. One example would be that, for example, in '97, the European Union, to us Danes' opinion, had developed a quite good solid body of common foreign policy on human rights advancement in the Human Rights Council of the UN. All of a sudden, the French president went to China. They'd done some deals with Taiwan, and the French national efforts tried to apparently do a lot of things, including selling military aircraft to the People's Republic of China. All of a sudden, that slowly built up body of common European human rights policy in the UN Human Rights Commission meant that the EU should not sponsor China-critical resolutions or draft resolutions criticizing China, I think rightly, for having perpetrated human rights violations. And all of a sudden, some of the biggest EU countries were siding with the French. We thought that we would like to uphold the discipline of the EU on this very important issue and actually pursue it, ending up being one of the member states represented in the UN Human Rights Commission being really punished by the Chinese government for doing this, and without the support and the collective sort of effort and solidarity that, of course, is a very, very necessary precondition for a successful European Union common policy. And we paid, I think, a very high bilateral price. We repaired it. But this is, of course, an example that shows that if we do not really uphold, not only in theory, but also in practice, these common policies on big and small issues, big states like yours and others can really play us up against each other and have a sort of very unfortunate, I think, process taking place inside the European Union, where some of the smaller member states probably are afraid of believing in the quality of the common policies. This very briefly to tell you that we have this first pillar where the European supranational policies are taking place, second pillar, the common foreign policy primarily, and in the third pillar, the cooperation in the field of justice and home affairs. Justice and home affairs doesn't sound probably as much to you Americans that we're trying to accomplish common policies in the field of justice and home affairs. But I can assure you that we Danes really, when hearing the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl talk about justice and home affairs, and imagine the ministries dealing with home affairs in member states, realizing that they would have to cooperate at a European level with other home secretaries, departments, and make all European policies. This is really big. It doesn't sound like that, it doesn't look like that, but this is really where Europe is really growing together, when you can make that kind of policies successfully be a result of European cooperation. We have had in some of the treaties, therefore also the wish to take this third pillar that is intergovernmental cooperation and move it over to the first pillar where it is supranational, where it would be a much more efficient and therefore hopefully successful justice and home affairs policy that would be conducted. We haven't really succeeded at that because of these ratification processes and the referendum that I just described in 2005 and 2008. This is where we are today and where we hope to be, I think, in the future. Will come now. And then if you move on. And then I think I will stop by one example. Our hopes in the European Union to the future is not just solely that we will be able to maybe you go one slide back, to have a United States that would participate in one of the most important new global endeavors, namely the climate agreement that should succeed the Kyoto Treaty. It's a funny priority, I can understand, when talking to many American students and universities and business people. But for us Europeans, we are already part of the Kyoto Treaty. We are doing exactly what the Kyoto Treaty sort of prescribes in terms of reducing our emissions. And we would see that climate policy as one of our high foreign policy priorities, also for the next administration of the United States. We are really grateful that both presidential candidates seem to be willing to do cap and trade and sort of be part of a process that would lead to a new global treaty on climate. It presupposes a lot of very progressive energy policies that could be solutions to not emitting so much greenhouse gases. And I think that it's fair to say that we Europeans, on that issue, with all its ramifications for global economy, for the kind of development assistance we need to give to, for example, Africa, would hope that the United States would really be part of this and not just do what you can yourselves, but really sign up to a global binding agreement. We accept that China and India should be part of this. That's also the findings in the IPCC assessments, that we cannot solve the sufficient emission reductions without having them on board and doing some comparable efforts. But I think it's really very important that it is the United States that teams up with Europe and starts leading on this very, very important issue. We had a good discussion here at the table where I was asked about the Danish performances, and I love, of course, as a Danish ambassador, talking about how well we've been able to, I think, handle these energy policies the last 35 years since we had the first real shock, the first oil crisis. But I think it's even more important to tell how well Europe is faring and how high the ambitions are of the European Union. We actually in Europe will want to do a 20% reduction of our total greenhouse emissions in 2020 by 1990 standards. I don't know if we can arrive at that, but all European Union member states really seems willing to take upon themselves that objective and risk and do the burden sharing these days and months inside the European Union. We in Denmark have been able to do maybe even better because we had a 99% dependency on foreign energy resources in 1973. We reduced that to almost 0 or 1 on foreign resources. And I always, of course, explain readily that we found oil and gas in big amounts in the North Sea, in the Danish part of the North Sea. But we've also done some of the things that made the Danish economy more internationally competitive, simply because we've been able to reap a lot of the low-hanging fruits in terms of energy efficiency. We've been able to incinerate waste. We've been able to create a very sizable sector of renewable energy that has produced companies, after having been born under an infant industry argument, into global competitive companies like Vestas, one of the biggest turbine producers in the world, a real important player here in the US, and companies in the biofuel like the Nisco and Novozymes that are very, very big players here in the United States. I was in Omaha yesterday. One of these Danish companies is making a $100 million investment in a biofuel plant together with Cargill in Blair, Nebraska, and they're doing a lot of that kind of investment. But we've been able to de-link Danish growth that the last 25, 30 years probably have been a little bit higher, maybe 1% than the US growth in those 25, 30 years, completely de-link that from energy consumption. So we have the same energy consumption today as we had then 25 years ago. That has given companies in Denmark and our household and our private lifestyle a lot of competitiveness, without which we could not have arrived at our level of affluence or been able to afford, for example, our development assistance at that very high level. EU altogether seems to be willing to do that. And let me conclude by saying I'm really impressed that all these new countries inside the European Union, East European countries, who really have a very different point of departure than we have. We probably in the West, Denmark, have, I guess, $50,000 per capita a year. These new members of the European Union are doing 1/10 of that, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 per capita per year, and still willing to do this conversion. So when you Americans have a discussion how painful it's going to be for the US economy, I think that's a very fair and legitimate and important debate. But if you look at Europe, you should be supported and impressed and think that if they can do it, you can do it maybe even better than us. So we would like to see you challenge us, compete with us on those issues, because it's in your own interest, but it's also in the global community's interest. I hope that I persuaded you, but also maybe made some provocative statements about EU as a superpower. And I certainly would be willing, as I said from the outset, to hear your remarks and comments, because that's really what I'm here to obtain. Thank you very much for your patience. I've spoken too long, but I hope that you will have many reactions. Thank you so much. Sure.
We can ask some questions.
It's about transferability of healthcare across countries to the EU, both for health services and possibly transferability of licensure, like physicians.
One of the limitations of European Union is that a lot of policies that are some of the most important policies are not yet common policies. Education and health are two of the most important political sectors, I guess, for Europe and for the United States for the future to get right. They are not, as of now, to any serious degree, common policies inside the European Union. We have, however, the freedom of movement, of labor, And in a country like Denmark, that probably by now has an unemployment rate of 2%, very full employment, had for a long time, scarcity in our hospitals. A small country like mine has always had universal health care. We try to deliver it in a growing quality. So we've imported doctors from Poland, from Lithuania, from Germany, and that has worked well for us because we simply thereby get that kind of increased number of doctors that we need in our health sector. And we couldn't have done that, I think, so easily as is now the case without that European Union cooperation, where this kind of old classical European border hindrances would have made that almost impossible. What I should use your question also to tell very openly is the one thing I also talked to you about, our colleague from Poland, namely that the biggest hindrance, of course, to European Union integration is not all these political obstacles or economic obstacles or loyalty or discipline for states, it's languages. I said to you that I would say here, which I really think is true, it's easier for us Danes, I guess for other Europeans, to come live in the United States, study, work here, because of your country's unity, culture, and languages. It would be more difficult for me and my family to come live in Warsaw or Berlin. German I speak, my wife is better in Italian and French. I only speak Danish, Swedish, German, and English, and French. My wife would have been happy in Italy and France. I could not speak Polish, my wife could not, and we would not be able to understand, therefore, TV or all the programs. Here, it's as living in Denmark because of the similarities and the many American programs we watch. So the languages, the barriers of integrating Europe is simply so deep. Lithuanians, they speak Lithuanian. Latvians speak Latvian. It's just really probably the best hope for us that we will start doing more and more of the communication in English. I like French, I like German, and I try to speak them all three. But I guess that my children and the future generations will have to give priority to that most commonly spoken language, English. And we see a lot of companies doing that. And would that work for the health sector? I don't think so. As of now, one of the big problems is that when we get Polish doctors and nurses into Danish hospitals, Danish patients expect a fluent speaking Danish because they are old citizens in a very difficult situation. But I think that health is really a very, very important issue. I cannot withhold one remark. The United States uses, I think, 16% of GDP on health. In Europe and all the other OECD countries, it's about half, 8-9%. And apparently, the output of these two different fractions of GDP are not very different. So there is some production differences that should be reviewed and looked very carefully upon, both in Europe and in the United States, because, and you are probably increasing your fraction. I see many studies, I talk to many American lawmakers that are willing to increase the American fraction maybe up to 18-19% of your GDP. That's a lot of resources, that's a lot of money. And if you don't get more what you call bang for the buck in terms of better output than we Europeans for the half, the systems have to be looked at structurally and in many ways, I think, scientifically. I know that Emory is an outstanding university for doctors and for health and for sciences. And I think that many of the best health services are produced and the best research are being delivered in the US. But there is also a comprehensiveness of the system that apparently needs to be attended to.
I'll start with a Chinese proverb which says, if you want to be rich for a day, plant rice. If you want to be rich for a decade, plant a tree. If you want to be rich for a century, have more children. I find the European Union's population growth is either zero, in many countries it's minus. What is European Union planning to do in terms of keeping your population pyramid not inverted but in a right way?
A very, very pertinent question. I know that the United States probably will have in the next 30 years, almost 100 million more citizens and inhabitants. You've had probably the last 30 years, almost 70 million more inhabitants. We in Europe, according to the curves I saw day before yesterday, will probably in the next couple of decades level out on these 500 million citizens. Not negative growth like you have in the Russian Federation, dramatically negative growth, but sort of level out. And we will be overtaken, therefore, at some point in time by the US in terms of population, unless things changed. In Europe, it's not something that you could talk at an all-European level. It would simply be, my personal impression, too sensitive to discuss that with the Italian or other countries' leaders, what to do about that kind of population policies, family policies, altogether policies that could create more population growth. In I think many countries in the north, we have quite a high fertility rate and a very high growth in our population. But it's two sensitive issues, and it's not the kind of issues that we would, I think, embark upon the foreseeable future. I really think that it's something that most politicians refrain from having strong strategic views on. It's a limitation to the superpower construction. It's probably a drawback for many other considerations as well. But as far as European Union is suffering so much unemployment is also the case in some of the big Eurozone countries, France and Germany. We have a lot of unemployed Europeans that possibly should be employed in, for example, countries like my own, where we have more than full employment. Very, very difficult issue. We don't even have, I think, many political talks on this in our nation states' political discourses. So we try to plant trees in many other ways by looking at the energy policies of ours, the sustainability of society in terms of education, how well are the educational systems, how well could they be brought. We try to plant trees in the sense that we try to reform our old European administrative structures. In Denmark, we've been able to increase our retirement age from 65 to 67 in the last 3-4 years as a recognition of our demography and change of the burdens of society. We've been able to do many other things that are similar to that. For example, we had 277 local municipalities. We reduced that to 100. You can imagine what kind of political process and courage that takes to take away so many mayorships. We've completely transformed the way we've organized our police. We knew that the same with the municipalities. If you want to give advanced public services in health, in education, in infrastructure, you need bigger entities where you, with the same amount of tax, can create better public services. The same with the police. If you want real efficient crime eradication, you need much bigger police districts. So we reduced or halved the number of police districts. Again, you can imagine what the police commissioner said when we took away half of their career possibilities. But that is what I see as some of the most imminent political challenges that European leaders are trying to embark upon and addressing. Sometimes successful, I could mention, but I will not, other European countries where these issues I just briefly mentioned, retirement age, restructuring of their societies, the ability to hire and fire, is not really moving anywhere. And that's going to be an all-European problem in the end, because what we Europeans have to realize is that this is not, even with an Obama administration, going to be a multilateral world where the international architecture and financing or the UN will play a dominant role. To some extent, yes, when it's in the US interest, I guess many Americans would say, even in a democratic administration. But it will be a much more multipolar world, wherein the US, China, Japan, India, Brazil, Russia, and hopefully a very strong European Union can solve many of the global issues together.
I know you touched a little on the Atlantic alliance, sort of what that means. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on whether or how much you think U.S. image or subsequent policy outcomes toward the European Union matter, and if you think member states might still be hesitant to example, the pricing of oil in euros or other measures that make the EU a greater superpower, but might also conflict with bilateral relations in the United States.
I'm terribly sorry. I have to have your first question once more.
I'm sort of trying to get a better sense of how much you think sort of the U.S. image of the European Union matters in terms of future integration and whether that can place a hold on the EU's progression as a superpower.
I think it matters some. We've been fortunate to have administrations here in the U.S. and politicians who always supported European integration. We've been having a very strong transatlantic cooperation on the enlargement of the alliance as well. And of course, without which we would have had enlarged the alliance. But I think it's fair to say that it is the internal European challenges that really sort of makes this successful or not so successful. It's a kind of problems that we've already discussed, the languages, the many barriers, and in expanding the European Union competences into areas like education and health. The example I should give, I think, on education, for example, is that yes, we Europeans may have gotten a big European Union, a big internal free market that is good for our companies. One of the most important things is education. We have, I think, really many splendid universities inside Europe, but we don't have the same kind of transparency and oversight as you have here, for example, in the United States, of where and how could you get exactly your education or your PhD degree refined to the best level. Here in the US, you really know these universities. You do compare them. You do compete and so on. I'm afraid that there are a sort of suboptimal situation inside Europe where many Danes or Germans would not know that there are great universities there and there doing exactly not just universities, but faculties and professors and teams with which you should actually be teaming up, because then the synergies and the critical mass would be exactly much bigger. So we are losing out on that kind of specific new resource allocation because of the character of the European Union. And that I think are more the real true challenges of European cooperation. But the United States have been very favorable to us, I think, politically. Also, this administration, when talking about what I said about the European security defense dimension, very fond of saying that we need a stronger and unified Europe. I even think as a Dane, and now I speak as a purely Danish ambassador, that it is really unfortunate that we've had a period of time now with 6-7 years of division, not just between the United States and Europe altogether, but also inside Europe. And I've said here very clearly that we try to side with the US. I also said that it's not always easy, and it never was. But we've always seen that as a strategic sort of direction for our country. We think that the enlargement of the European Union is a smart move by the European Union to keep Europe unified and at peace. But also, it is smart to have all these East European countries on board, given their experience with Russia, so that we can have not just a smarter relationship because of our thinking on our relationship with the USA, but also on our relationship with Russia, and that hopefully it could be a more qualified European cooperation and action with Russia, given that some have sort of been inside that Soviet Union. Are we getting there? I think so. But that would be more or less my take on that.
Do you think that they will ever be, do you think Western Europe will be prevented from agreeing to their admission to the European Union or NATO because of pressure from Russia?
Very important questions. I think that Turkey is rightfully inside the alliance, and I would actually think that your description of Turkey's relationship with Europe is not completely correct. I think we are in the midst of accession negotiations with the Turks. You could argue that we've been that for a very long time, but I don't think we are raising the bar. I think we are, many European leaders, when we commenced these accession negotiation talks with Turkey, in '05, October, I think, 3rd, '05, ready to treat them as equal as we've done with Spain, Portugal, Greece, and all the others. Turkey is a very composite country. In the east, a medieval Turkey, and the west, a very advanced Turkey that is probably as advanced as some of the existing members, economically. Politically, we've defined in Copenhagen in June 1993 the so-called Copenhagen political criteria and economic criteria. What exactly should a country be at in terms of level of democratic development and economic capitalistic market development in order to gain that status as a candidate? Turkey has arrived at that in 2004 and 2005, and therefore we've accepted them as a candidate country that is in the midst of accession negotiations. Then some of the European Union members, and I'm trying to be very blunt, some of the members in the south, probably Cyprus and Greece and others, have made the Turks made some mistakes, or altogether maybe not just a black and white game, but made some problems with that accession negotiations process. So that, and Austria, but
people whose ethnicity was not Turkish.
But-
As a condition.
But the way that I just briefly a while ago described the accession negotiations, that as in reality a one-sided adjustment to that level of, you could call it many things, but sophistication and advancedness of European Union legislation, Turkey is only in the process of overtaking, chapter by chapter, environment, financial institutions, regulations, veterinary standards, veterinary standards, all the other standards that you need to have an internal market functioning. They are in the process of doing that. The present government is doing that with the Turkish parliament. But the kind of Turkey we could take in would have to be a fully fledged European democracy in the end, like the East European countries were able to bring about in very few years, from 1990, 1989, 1990 to 2002, 2004. Turkey has been doing this even before we Danes and Brits and Irish joined the European Union. It was part of the acquis communautaire when we joined, that Turkey should have a possibility for becoming a member. But it is a delicate issue. On top of all what I've just said, of course, there is this other very important discussion, that this is a country in which you have a very strong division between politics and religion. It's certainly a very clear Islamic country, but a country with which you can deal, and we do that in NATO. But it raises internal domestic problems in, for example, the country you mentioned, and others. I think that the best the Turks could do is to really do their utmost to take upon themselves all these chapters of European Union legislation in the parliament, and then also implement these laws so well that they can enforce it, and thereby make a very qualified bid for European Union membership. Georgia, Ukraine, many European leaders would today think that they have a European perspective, but you have to have at some point in time a discussion of European Union's sort of finality. What is the ultimate stretch of European Union? What can we overcome? How diluted can we be? Some would argue inside the existing European Union that this kind of expansion that people like myself and my government and a few other governments sort of in an accelerated, intensified process brought upon Europe is not really sustainable, that we have diluted some of the qualities of the cooperation. And I have to be very careful here. Some of the presidencies, maybe even the present presidency, the French presidency, have had meetings where it's very much the French presidency and not so much the European Union that plays a role. And that's because it's still very important for a French president to tell his French voters that he's a very active president of the European Union, because they can vote and re-elect him or make him popular or successful in France. And it's still not so important for him, of course, to be enjoying support by all the others as it is for him to be a French president. I'm in no way criticizing what they're doing, but there are different ways of handling the European Union presidencies. And I think that many small countries, for example, have done brilliant presidencies because they've had easier times sort of working for the whole of the Union, never ever thinking of in any way sacrificing national interest. The French would argue, yeah, but that's also so small countries that they have no national interest to really lose, probably. But this is really where we are. And this is hopefully helpful for you in understanding what is this European Union about. It is really a difficult discussion.
But do you think Russia's pressure can keep Georgia and Ukraine?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that many Europeans have an attitude towards Russia that is really based upon a long period of time of cooperation with the Russians, for good and bad. And I sense sometimes that there is a difference between the worry and the angst and anxiety in some American quarters and many big European quarters. We seem to have gotten so well along with the Russians, in spite of all the wrong things they've done, annexing South Ossetia and Abkhazia, recognizing them, but still see that you have to be what here in foreign policy schools probably would be a realist approach to them, given what you also said about the energy supplies and dependency. But I don't see them having a veto on this. But I see us being patient and in the long run very successful with European integration and with. We've come so long. I'm a relatively young man. I've only been in the Foreign Service for 30 years. 12 of those years were the Cold War. What we've done the last 18 years is, of course, extremely gratifying, very rewarding. We have to be patient, us in Europe. We don't easily go to wars. We have to discuss this for a long period of time, and maybe we don't even draw conclusions in you Americans sort of view. We just let it roll on and don't solve it. But actually we do think that these processes sometimes are very useful. It does give us the sense of being on the right direction, gradually improving our situation. And you have to bear in mind, and that will be my last remark, that we've come a long way from that kind of Europe that I very, very briefly alluded to, that war-producing, conflict-haunted continent that where Danish borders were moving every single decade or century so many times that we don't even know what but we can see on the maps what year that was and so on. Terrible history, but we think that we've produced a new mechanism for peace and prosperity and for a rising superpower, integration.
Thank you very much. We've been reminded by your staff that you're on a tight schedule here, and we've already run over on his schedule. That's why we had to stop our questions now. I want to thank you so much. I have a little gift to give you, hopefully, and we'll have that presented to you on your way out. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it.